The year 1647 abounded with omens. Strange signs and portents of terrible disasters appeared on the earth and in the skies. A plague of locusts spilled out of the wild lands in the spring, a sure sign of Tartar incursions, possibly even a great war. In early summer, the sun disappeared under an eclipse. Soon afterwards, a comet trailed fire through the sky. In Warsaw, people saw tombs and fiery crosses in the clouds, and so gave alms and fasted, reading in these signs a terrible calamity that would fall on the land and ravage all mankind. When winter came, it was so mild that the oldest people couldn't remember anything to match it. No ice gripped the rivers of the south. Swollen with rain and melting snows, they burst from their course and flooded the swamp. And in the Bratislav territory, at the eastern boundary, and all across unpopulated wildlands, the noon sun burned with such intense summer brightness that a great blanket of new grasses sprung in December. Beehives hummed in the border settlements, and herds of cattle bellowed restless calls of spring. With these signs and warnings, and with the natural order of the season so unnaturally reversed, all eyes in the eastern territories turned fearfully to the wild lands, since peril of every kind could come from those untamed spaces quicker than from any other quarter. That was from With Fire and Sword by Henryk Sienkiewicz. First two paragraphs. Hello.
Hello.
How's it going, Jacek?
I'm doing okay. How are you, big brother?
Doing good. So, this is, I think, the first book podcast I'm recording, just specifically about a book, as I tangle with tangleness that I have going on here. All these stupid wires. So, do you know anything about Henryk Sienkiewicz? Anything of the sort about what we're going to talk about with Fire and Sword?
I don't know anything about the author. A bit about the background of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the time. But I feel like you're going to get into it a little bit more, so I don't have to ramble on. So
yeah, we're going to get into a little bit of his background. I want to save some of it because he has a very interesting story. Another Polish person who came into the United States, surprisingly. There's millions of them, and then came back into Poland to start his actual writing career. But before we get into that, and we're going to talk about his early life. So before we get into anything else, we are going to brush over some history. We need to get into the author, Henryk Sienkiewicz's life. I don't want to get too deep into his life, but here are the basic facts. Henryk Sienkiewicz was born in Wola Śląska on 5 May 1846. So he's a fellow Taurus. Roar.
Yeah. Do you know where that small town in Poland is?
It's on the eastern border.
Okay.
It's actually in the Russian territory.
Okay. Like in western Ukraine right now, or?
No, it's deeply in Poland. So at this point in the history, his hometown is part of the Russian Empire, and I'd say red flags, but not that literally just yet.
So probably Lubelski or Mazovia, one of those places, or is it by Białystok or something like that?
I think it's south of Białystok.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, it's firmly in modern day Polish territory.
Okay.
Yeah. At this point in Polish history, I just said that, Henryk was born to an impoverished Polish noble family. Much of his impoverishment was probably due to the historical influences of his life, which we will touch upon later on. He went to the Imperial University in Warsaw, where he failed at STEM and transferred to philosophy and history, which is where he became fascinated with the old Polish language and knowledgeable of its history and its literature.
Yeah, a Polish guy failing on STEM sounds pretty familiar to people in our family, but yeah.
Yeah. Skipping ahead to more pertinent stuff to this episode, Henryk traveled to the United States, like I said, first in New York and later settling for some time in California. He wrote as a journalist throughout this time and throughout all of his travels, much of it involving the status of Polish people abroad, specifically in the United States, and the identity of the Polish people, who at this point did not have a nation. He returned to the former Polish territory in 1879, specifically to Kiev, where he continued to be a journalist. He also wrote short stories and novellas, continuing to entrench himself in the literary world. He shifted his focus from shorter pieces to writing what I would describe as Goliath historical fiction novels eventually. In 1883, he began to write and publish his first real massive book. It was called Wielkie Gniezdo, which translates to wolf's lair, but it was later changed to ogniem I mieczem, with fire and sword, which we're going to talk about today. And anybody who is Polish and listening to my American bastardized accent of it, apologies. But you grow up in America, you don't get to be a Polish accent. This pivot to historical literature is also a part of history itself, because in 1905, Henryk Sienkiewicz was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. The prize motivation on the Nobel Prize's website states that his accomplishment is because of his outstanding merits as an epic writer. His residence at the time of the award is actually stated as Poland in 1905.
Well, I knew. I didn't think they actually would do it as Poland, but I knew around that time there were a couple Nobel laureates around Poland. So you said when did he leave Poland again? What year?
Ooh, I didn't say anything about when he left, and I don't have it right down. He returned back from
in 1879.
79,
yeah, because in 1863 to 1864, I think there was this January uprising.
We're going to talk about that.
Oh yeah, so after the January uprising, the Polish countryside and cities were basically rendered impotent in military matters. The Polish intellectuals decided to focus on things like writing and the sciences and stuff like that to kind of boost their international fame, kind of recognize people, and Sienkiewicz was part of that.
Yeah,
I'm assuming.
Definitely. So we're going to talk about the January uprising and what happened a little bit further on, and we're not going to get too deep into the details, but absolutely. And when you don't have a military as a country or a nationality, you're not going to be able to have a country, right?
Yeah. For a while, they didn't have anything for a while, and then whatever. I'm not going to get into Piłsudski right now, but yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, if you're an astute listener and somebody with cursory knowledge of this part of Europe, Poland is not a nation. Further quoting the NobelPrize.org on his writing, quote, Henryk is best known for his epic historical novels. He began writing them during the 1880s and published them as serial installments in Polish newspapers. Comprehensive historical studies formed the basis for his great trilogy of Polish life during the mid-17th century, with Fire and Sword, The Deluge, and Fire in the Steppe. The trilogy entwines facts, fiction, and a strong patriotic undertone. These novels became such an important part of Polish identity that they are simply referred to as the trilogy. So before getting into the story, I want to talk about the text itself, the most recent English translation, because we need to talk about translation a little bit when we're talking about, any type of book that was translated from a different author to a different language, because that really does influence how the book should be read. The version I used was published in 1991, making it older than us. And the translation was by W.S. Kunichek, who I might do an episode way down the line in the future, because he translated every single book in the trilogy, and he would later write his own historical trilogy, which I believe is about World War II. He was able to take this massive undertaking of translating this trilogy, as well as other famous books by Sienkiewicz, because of the financial backing of the Copernicus Society of America, who had a dedicated fund for Polish work translations. Along with the Copernicus Society, the physical publishing of the texts was done by, I think it's called Hippocrene Books, if I can pronounce that correctly. You might not know much about them, but they publish a lot of foreign language books, including multi-language dictionaries, international cuisine books, and foreign and custom tradition texts. It's kind of like the same vibe as the Dune books, where like some random map book maker decided that he wanted to publishing science fiction. It's completely out of the blue.
Left field, yeah. It was a map maker, right? The Dune books, yeah.
Yeah. So instead of that, we were talking about
and then
dictionary, English to Spanish, English to Lithuanian dictionary books,
Polish novelizations. Oh yeah, the Copernicus Society. So I went to I got a master's degree in the University of Warsaw. I mean, it was in English, but it's a big campus, and my campus was my building, basically, where I took literally every class. You had to go by the Copernicus Society in Warsaw, and there's just this big, massive statue of Copernicus. Copernicus was this he's this call to fame, I guess, in terms of like medieval Polish science and or early modern Polish science, but like we can't even like confirm that the guy spoke Polish or like he literally never wrote in Polish or like any like he considered like himself Polish. But I don't think he would have called himself German either. But yeah, he lived in like a area that eventually became Polish in his time life, Torun. But I think he was born in Prussian lands, ducal Prussian lands. But yeah.
You know what? I'm glad that you added on, because I couldn't find anything diddly squat about the Copernicus Society. The books were written, or excuse me, the Copernicus Society of Pennsylvania is who actually helped pay for this, and I like looked it up on Google, and I was like, I don't
know if it's the same, but there's like
I'm sure it's the same.
Yeah,
it's
Copernicus Institute or something, and it's like near
or something similar, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's the same vibes.
Near Old Town.
Yeah, so moving on, like, these books are difficult to get, but you can find the first early translations, so not by Kunicek, other ones that were done in the 1880s in the public domain, and many, if not all, can be found on Project Gutenberg. Are you familiar with Project Gutenberg at all?
That's the online one, right? Where
Yeah, anything that's in the public domain, some honestly genius decided that he wanted to try to put everything on there. That's a fascinating story. That guy was a tragic character of early modern American internet culture for sure. Yeah, and I just want to highlight the translator every single time, because this was also a masterpiece of translation. My one criticism, however, is when he translated the main character names, he made it so they were as phonetically similar as possible to pronounce them to English, and this made it difficult for me personally to read and go, what's this name actually mean? He would change W's to V's. He would do like all sorts of things to make it like, I don't know, very, very difficult for somebody who actually knows what a name is supposed to pronounce. And at a certain point, like, who gives a shit, right? Like to pronounce the name. These are all such crazy long names that like you might as well have a Tolkien-esque, oh, you're supposed to pronounce it this way. It's like, but I want to pronounce it that way, like it's a mythical character. He wanted to try to honor it, but he also changed that.
Changed the names. Just, I guess, so people didn't say it incorrectly. I don't understand why you would do that. Someone who gets his name constantly mispronounced. I'm always on the stand of just keep your name spelled as it is.
Yeah, Christina, my wife, is like, because we're gonna have a baby, right? So I don't want to name the baby that like will possibly be mispronounced or misspelled ever. And she looks at me every time and is like, I am totally fine with saying Phil with a PH as opposed with an F. Like, I am proud of my name. I don't care. At least people like kind of pronounce my name 75% of the time right. Yeah.
That's a high. I get excited when someone gets my name right.
I know, right? It's kind of whatever. It's like, it's my name. I'm happy with it. Yeah. You can pick your friends. You can pick your nose, but you can't pick your name. Or you can.
People are doing that a lot right now. Yeah.
That's definitely not how the saying goes either. All right. Well, Henryk Sienkiewicz was given access to diaries, first-hand accounts, and other historical documents in order for him to construct this novel. However, he didn't let history get in the way of writing a good story. It is important to point out, much of what he wrote is largely true, but like all history in general, historical fiction specifically has a huge bias. We will go over some of these biases shortly, but you might be thinking, I don't like historical fiction. Why would you even write about that? What is historical fiction after all? Am I going to even enjoy this? Yes. It's exactly what it sounds. It's fiction that surrounds historical events or a singular event. It takes elements from the historically accurate and fabricates elements to create a good story. This was very popular in the 19th century, actually. It emerged into popularity in the early 1800s, with Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe being one of the first popular narratives in the genre in the English language. Because bias plays such a heavy role in history and subsequently historical fiction, this became another way for nations to find identity through art. A great example of this is Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, which was published only 15 years prior to With Fire and Sword. It was only a matter of time that a Pole would do something similar with Polish identity and history, and Henryk Sienkiewicz chose a historical event that many people in his age and many people today still consider a pivotal event in Polish history. To understand his work, we need to talk context. Specifically, we need to start talking about the 17th century political reforms that happened in Poland. We are going to be talking broad strokes for a lot of this, too. Poland at the time was the most influential part of the greater Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that, at its peak, spanned from the Baltic Sea all the way down basically to the Black Sea, and included areas where present-day countries of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Slovakia, Czechia, Latvia, Belarus, and more that I'm sure I'm missing.
Yeah, I think a little bit of Romania and Bulgaria. Not Bulgaria. What's it called? Moldova? Not Moldova. But I have a map right here.
Yeah, Moldova's in the western part of Ukraine, right?
Yeah, Moldova.
Okay.
I think so. Basically that area, but yeah, Western Galicia, Eastern Galicia, proper ancient name for that, but yeah.
Yeah, we're going to talk what I tried to do is avoid ancient names as much as possible, like to make it more approachable. Yeah. And like we're going to talk about Cossacks. I left out Tartars. I left out so many like cultures that there's so much going on. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth effectively came to be when royal families, one from Poland and the other from Lithuania, married. This united the two nations or empires and allowed for one kingdom to thrive. It's important to note that from its very inception, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a multi-ethnic empire and permitted ethnicities to thrive under their own religion and culture. True, certain ethnicities will have more power throughout its entire history, and for our story's sake, it's mostly Poles, as they often were the royalty in overlooked areas, people that aren't traditionally ethnically Polish, such as the Cossacks in modern-day Ukraine that we were talking about.
And Ruthenians, which are like Ukrainians, and Belarusians kind of mixed up together. Eastern Orthodox people who were Slavic but didn't consider themselves Russian are typically considered Ruthenians.
We're not going to talk about Ruthenian at all, but they are a huge part of the book, actually. We're going to focus on Cossacks specifically.
Yeah, the Polish kings, or it's more like the Polish nobility, too. I think you'll bring it up, but Poland, they were bringing in certain kings. I think there was a Transylvanian, so like a Hungarian.
We're going to bring this up.
Yeah, he was the king at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that nobility Polish nobility was the strongest part of that area, which basically ran the kingdom.
And because Poland was this massive multi-ethnic commonwealth that was not created to be one big absolute monarchy, but in union of two nations and multiple nations after its conquering. Parliamentary system that ultimately was devised was one of the strongest parliamentary systems in of its time, if you think of it specifically, of exercising more rights and privileges than its European counterparts to the people of the parliament. Though we're not going to get carried away thinking that this is actually democracy.
Yeah.
In short, the parliament, called the Sejm,
The same.
Yeah. Had two chambers. The higher chamber consisting mostly of the higher ecclesiastical and secular officials. These were high nobles and people in religion, specifically the Catholic religion, but not exclusively. And then the lower chamber was represented by the lower class of nobles, often Polish, but also Lithuanian, Cossack, and other ethnicities as well. What is truly fascinating about the Polish nobility is that, despite massive differences between ownership of land and wealth, nobles shared fairly equal status and rights. Of course, if you were a peasant, or heaven forbid, an Armenian or a Jewish person, a merchant at the time, you were of a totally different class.
Yeah. I mean, Jews have, especially at the time, it's a unique history. They were kind of, especially when they're sent east to, where we're going to talk about, they were seen as these middlemen that could be used between the peasantry and the landlords. But they were also pretty heavily part of the middle-ish class. I mean, there wasn't really much of a middle class in Poland, but the merchant class and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into too much about Polish relations with Jewish people, but it doesn't end well when you put people as middle managers between an oppressive noble class and the peasantry.
No. I mean, I didn't write it down, but it is important to note that they actually had the Jewish population and the Armenian population, because they were the merchant class, had a lot more privileges and rights than they would in other countries at the time in Europe, too.
I mean, it's a relative.
It's very relative, yeah.
Yeah.
So talking about the political structure, we're going to have to jump a little bit here and talk about the Liberium veto and how it culminated. Are you familiar with the Liberium veto?
Yeah.
Not Liberium, Liberum. To best describe the Liberium veto, I'm going to just quote it from Encyclopedia Britannica, because I feel like this was the best explanation. Liberium veto in Polish history is the legal right of each member of the Sejm, or the legislature, to defeat by his vote alone any measure under consideration, or to dissolve the Sejm and nullify all acts passed during its session, based on the assumption that all members of the Polish nobility were absolutely equal politically. The veto meant, in practice, that every bill introduced had to be passed unanimously. It was first used to dissolve a session of the Sejm in 1652. Subsequently, it was used extensively, often paralyzing the government, making a centralization of power opposed by nobles jealous of their independence impossible, and leaving Poland vulnerable to the influence of foreign powers, which habitually bribed delegates to force the adjournment of sessions that threatened to pass legislation contrary to their interests. End quote.
I guess the idea behind that was like, hey, let's all work together as nobility, this like small, like 6 to 8% or something of the country. But it was a very clear misstep in creating the Sejm, just to make everything unanimous. Have to be unanimous.
Every single opinion has to be the same, which is nuts. It's a nuts way to form a government.
It worked out when you had like this fervor in the Polish government when they first started to kind of work together. But after 100 years of voting for their kings, things tend to break apart. You can see it kind of happening all the time everywhere. But
yeah. It's absolutely bonkers, and it's why, one of the reasons why the downfall happened, we'll talk about later, of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Another crazy thing about the Polish noble history that is also very important to know, specifically for this book, is that for centuries, Polish kings were elected by the Sejm. True, many kings did come from Polish family lineages when there was a clear heir to the throne, but the king still had to be voted in regardless.
Yeah.
It was when there was no true heir when things got really, really funky. King of multi-ethnic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth did not have to even come from the Commonwealth itself. In fact, kings were elected from places like Finland, Saxony, Hungary, and most infamously and influential in the second book of the trilogy, several Swedish kings were elected.
Yeah, those.
And this is a big no-no.
Those what's it called, Vasa fucking shitheads. They're just incompetent idiots in charge of the whole country. I don't have a lot to say right about the Vasa, but they would have someone with like some Polish nobility behind them, like in the distant past, like their grandmother was, not distant past, like 1 to 2 generations, like their mother was Polish or something like that, and they might elect him, but like doesn't mean they're Polish, and doesn't mean they understand how to govern the specific type of state that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was.
Yeah, and the concept of the Sejm being indecisive, and this concept of voting for a king will actually play huge roles of this epic novel in all three of them. There will be many points where the nobles are bickering who should be in charge of an army, only for them to be completely embarrassed by enemy forces because of their indecision, and nobody is in charge of it. Furthermore, there will be an election of the king, like I said, with, speaking of which, a Swede and a Frenchman on the ballot, though you can look up who actually gets elected. So this type of monarchical government where the Sejm had a lot of power and thereby can be corrupted easily, mixed with a nobility that shares more loyalty to one's region and ethnic identity than to a state as a whole, started to become a real freaking problem in Poland around the later half of the 17th century. This time frame also coincided with the advent of enlightened monarch and the political concept of enlightened absolutism. Many of these enlightened monarchs believed that they were destined to rule their sovereignty and exercised absolute power when doing so. This is the brief definition, but you get the gist. One of the most known absolute monarchs was Russia's Catherine the Great. I'm going to yada, yada, yada this, and I'm going to miss a lot of history, but essentially, using a mix of soft influence tactics and a little strong arming, she was able to use Russian-controlled Polish nobles to pass what is now known as the Cardinal Laws, which effectively put into law all of the things that made Poland so difficult to govern, one of which was the liberum veto that we talked about earlier. Also, the kingdoms of Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary signed a secret agreement to try to keep Poland's territories as status quo a few decades before that. Inevitably, a group of conservative Poles who feared outside influence and a reduction of their own rights formed a confederation of nobles at the Bar Fortress, otherwise known in English as the Bar Confederation, which is sometimes that what I call when the rugby team goes downtown.
Yeah, I think she made sure that veto was it was already in place, but Catherine was like making sure that you couldn't change the laws because she could tell it's not going well at the time, surrounded by all these absolute monarchs.
Well, like any other time when you're going downtown with your bros, the Bar Confederation ended up causing some civil war, and Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary seized the opportunity to. Big sigh here. Invade Poland. This resulted in the first partition of Poland. There would be 3 in total in 1772, 1793, and 1795. The last one would eradicate Poland from the map for 123 years. The Fortress of Bar is important in this context specifically because it is actually a major plot point in the book that we're talking about. It is revered by Sienkiewicz as one of the most impenetrable fortresses, but indeed, it did get penetrated.
I get it, Phil. I get it.
Now, we're going to talk about the January uprisings. A lot of this historical context is what we were talking about, why this book was written, and I need to provide a little bit more. Not necessarily what the book was written about, but actually not what we need to know about Poland, but actually what the story is about. The last partition happened about 50 years before Sienkiewicz was born, around 2 generations of people, meaning that there are still old people who would have known an independent Polish state. Just because there was no state did not mean there was no national identity. Again, yada, yada, yada-ing this, but eventually this bubbled into what was called the January Uprising in Poland. This was a 6-month period of insurgency that occurred in 1863 with the goal of having Poland return as a nation. This occurred when Henryk was about 19 years old, and though I believe he was living in Poland at this time, I actually think he was. I don't actually think he participated in this at all personally. Many people did, though, including many lower nobles, clergy, and other intellectuals who shared in this belief of a unified Poland state. This gets to be confusing, but I found it funny that if there were effectively 2 political factions, one that wanted to reinstate a liberal monarch who was called the Whites, one who wanted to share democratic processes with peasants, workers, and clergy called the Reds, which confusing because this is also around the time as Engels and Marx writing, but they were not influenced by him at all.
No. I mean, they were influenced by socialists, not Marx and Engels, but there are early socialists out there, in France specifically. I think Blanqui was around. He might have been writing, definitely by 63. Yeah, I mean, you yada yada, but there were also several. I mean, there was besides the Napoleonic era where there was a Duchy of Warsaw, there were like other periods of insurrections in 1830 and 1848 in some places in Western Poland. So like you didn't just have like these people around. You had these points of contact, these historical markers to like look back to, like, yeah, we did try and we failed eventually, but this is something to look forward to again. Maybe next time it'll work. Very, very similar to like the Irish and their different uprisings and the risings.
Ultimately, the January uprising failed, and the repercussions were swift and harsh. Tens of thousands of Polish people were sent to Siberia. Not the first time, not the last.
Won't be the last time.
The vast majority of them were of the Schlata class or the nobility of some sort. They imposed heavy taxes as a war indemnity, and also they abolished serfdom in Poland as a direct result of this, which is...
Yeah, the Reds had this call to... They worked with the whites at some point, and they agreed to do to have serfdom as part of the conditions, as well as an open Poland. And what was his name? Nicholas III, the Tsar emancipator. He eventually he was going to do it anyways. I mean, that was his plan. So it was this unfortunate historical happenstance where the Reds had this idea of abolishing serfdom in Poland, and the Russian Empire was already going to do it all over. So just kind of kicked the knees under the peasant part of the insurrection a little bit.
Yeah, and actually abolishing serfdom basically crippled the Polish gentry as well, financially, which good, because serfdom is bad. Maybe we'll, as Americans, probably see something similar to that, and you start instituting all illegal immigrants into camps. Who knows? The action by the Russian, in particular, had dire consequences that are still felt today as well. One could argue, and I'm not going to argue this, but this might have been the origin of long, deep-seated disdain between Poles and Russians politically, not necessarily the partitions of Poland. Putting down the uprising really, really pissed people off.
Yeah, I mean, it was a nail on... I don't know. I mean, it was a big one that they did.
Nail in the coffin.
Yeah. But how many people? Tens of thousands of people. But even the first partition of the Kosciuszko uprising, 10,000 Polish people were killed in Warsaw. They have a lot to not like the Russian Empire about.
So all this is important because the effects of that were felt, and the reprisals were still being felt in 1883 when With Fire and Sword was written. Sienkiewicz wanted to write something to help lift the morale of the Polish people during a time when it was at its lowest. This, along with every book in the trilogy, was a way to express Polish patriotism when there was no sovereign Poland to be had. So we're going to talk now about why the book was important to Poles, not necessarily just why Henryk Sienkiewicz wrote it, and also why this time is also important to Ukrainians. Even though there are some parts of the book that are absolutely fabricated, hence historical fiction, much of it was written actually had a lot of elements of that was true. Apart from these things like the love story that was completely fake for plot reasons, and also the animosity between the protagonist and the main antagonist of this love story, this book describes warfare and the time frame very well. Bias will always be a part of history, as I said, and in historical fiction, it runs rampant. It doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy it, but you should definitely educate yourself on what the facts was, because fiction is fiction. Yeah. And that's why we're talking about it. The book's framework revolves around the first year of the Polish Cossack War, otherwise known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising. It's called the Khmelnytsky Uprising because of a famous Cossack leader called Bogdan Khmelnytsky. We will talk more about him as he is the main antagonist. Excuse me when I said that there was a love story between a main antagonist. It wasn't the main antagonist. There's two of them in this book. But I want to dispel facts about this famous historical figure because this uprising will be incredibly important implications that are felt to this day. Firstly, let's talk about Cossacks, other than the fact that they have a very funny English name.
Cossack.
Cossacks were Eastern European Slavic peoples who primarily followed the Eastern Orthodox Christian religions. They first emerged around the 9th century AD. Yep. They lived in the steppe lands that are currently part of eastern Ukraine and southern Russia. They were also traditionally nomadic, but they became less so throughout the centuries. After this part of the world was seized under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Cossacks were actually given a very high degree of self-governance in exchange for their military services. You see, them being the buffer between the Christian Europe that we all know and love and the threats of the South and the Southeast made them into the tough and valuable warriors that were really, really revered. Furthermore, their semi-nomadic lifestyle on the Eurasian steppes made them excellent with horses. I won't get into the different groups of Cossacks too much, as we're already going into the weeds a bit, but suffice to say they were great both in infantry and cavalry. The specific group of Cossacks that I will mention are the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who lived near modern-day southeastern Ukraine.
Yeah, it's super easy for those who've been following the Ukrainian war, that same area, which has been in war about 100,000 times. But yeah,
I mean, they're still great warriors.
Yeah.
And that's what they were known for.
But yeah, I think the Cossacks were like the Bulgarians. They were like a Turkic people too that eventually adopted like Slavic language and Slavic customs and stuff like that, kind of introduced into this like common Slavic identity that was in the area.
There's so many ethnic groups in this area and so many people involved in this war. We're not going to talk about all of them. Simply put, the Bulgarians weren't even mentioned in the book.
Oh.
I had to admit understanding there because I was like, I'm not going down this rabbit hole. We're going to meet our villain a little bit now, the real historical person, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and talk about the facts of his life. Our villain of the book was born in 1595, probably December 27th, in the village of Subidov, right in the heart of present-day central Ukraine. Maybe. He was born into the lesser nobility during the time that was considered the golden age of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. At 22, he joined the service of the Commonwealth, serving with his father. He was held captive by the Ottomans in Constantinople for a while and then returned home. He remained in good standing with the Commonwealth until the Polish nobles harassed him in an attempt to force him off his family's land. He went to the Polish king to plead his case about his land and was even provided with a royal charter protecting his lands. But the lawlessness of the region, of the Commonwealth that he lived in, and the political structure of the entire Commonwealth made it impossible to enforce. Raids performed on behalf of this nobility caused considerable damage on his land. He also received no help from Polish authorities whatsoever. Fed up, he began to travel from one Cossack leader to another to discuss injustices done to him and to them as well. And soon he gained massive support, as he was well respected by these leaders and military figures. He was promptly arrested, but later escaped with the help of certain Polish figures. The actual guy in history who really isn't important, who actually helped him escape, because our author, Sienkiewicz, changes this narrative, so our main protagonist actually is the one who accidentally allows for his release and escape, and it is actually a crazy accident.
Yep. I mean, historical fiction, it's going to do some things that, some connections that definitely wouldn't have happened in real life, you know?
Yeah. I could probably blot this out later, but it happens in the first chapter, so... basically what happens is he finds this guy who's got a rope around his neck and being dragged by horses, and he unleashes him, and that's Bohdan. And he just lets him go.
Yeah, I'm sure he wasn't treated that poorly. No.
Yeah, I'm not spoiling too much if you read this book. It's literally the first chapter.
Yeah.
The Cossacks were happy to listen to Khmelnytsky, partly because of his good standing, but also because they weren't happy that the Polish king canceled their attacks on the Ottoman Empire, which was done annually and almost like a tradition to bleed new soldiers in.
Yeah. Also, the slave trade was like still happening in the Cossacks. They were slavers taking.
Yes, they were.
Yeah, taking peasants and soldiers and putting them into slavery, and it's a reprehensible act, but it was part of their economy. It just pissed them off.
Yeah, and that. I didn't talk about slavery, but it's actually a big part of this story too. Especially the first part, when you're reading it, you're reading, oh my God, the Cossacks are taking slaves constantly.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, these were also incredibly lucrative, and it was basically the way that they ran their economy, to raid countrysides. So in 1648, Khmelnytsky and his followers began their own little rebellion, which would last 9 whole years. This would be an incredibly complicated, bloody, and disastrous war. Nearly all Polish nobles, officials, and priests were either killed or removed from what is now present-day Ukraine. Massacres were incredibly commonplace, often done by Cossacks against Poles, but also Cossacks against peasants and, of course, the Jewish population. If there's one thing you need to know about massacres in Europe, the Jewish people are almost always going to be targeted. One battle alone saw the massacre of about 3,000 to 5,000 Polish captives, while the Jewish population saw a low of about 40,000 and a high of 100,000 people massacred in total. This period of time is still considered one of the most tragic events in Jewish history until, of course, it was upstaged by something that we all know. That definitely 100% happened in Europe. And, of course, there were reprisals, and the Polish armies massacred the Cossacks and also massacred the supporting peasants.
Oh, yeah. Jewish people couldn't get a break. I mean, even like the Białystok uprising in the 19th century by the Russian officials, not uprising, pogrom, sorry. The Białystok pogrom was like 60,000 or something, like a huge amount, but yeah.
Yeah, we were talking, 16,000. Wow. The first podcast I recorded, it was with Rogelio, and we were talking about Isaac Babel, who is he was a Jewish person from Odessa, right? And he grew up with all these pogroms that happened all around him, specifically the pogrom that happened in Odessa at the time. And like they were hundreds of people, not 16,000 total, like just constantly throughout history. The result of this uprising was the beginning of what is called the deluge. Yes, the same deluge as the second book is named after. We have already gone well into the weeds about talking about the book, so I'm not going to say anything other than the total killed in this time between the start of the uprising and the end of the deluge is around roughly 4 million people. The result of this conflict effectively was the rise of Ukrainian identity as we know it today as well. Khmelnytsky is viewed in very different lights in Poland, where he is a traitor and an instigator, and in Ukraine, where he's considered a national hero. He, to put a bow on him, died of cerebral hemorrhage on August 6, 1657, formally ending his uprising, as the period of the deluge actually still continued for a few more years. The Cossacks would eventually become modern-day Ukrainians, along with several other ethnic groups, like the Ruthenians that you said, and other ones as well. Their culture would be continued all the way to the Bolshevik Revolution, where it would be suppressed brutally by the Bolsheviks themselves. The book, With Fire and Sword, is set only in the first year, and maybe to the year and a half of this conflict, when there was Polish victories to actually celebrate. It ends with an epic siege battle scene with the kind of glory and sacrifice and terror common in war stories. Much of this book is comprised of detailed and incredibly well-written battle scenes as well. It truly reads like a fantasy novel, except it's based on concrete historical events and battles. So, we talked a lot about the history of the book. We talked a lot of context.
Yeah. Just real quick, I was a bit wrong about the Białystok uprising. It was 88 people officially killed.
88, okay.
I think that's, I'm not sure where I got that 80,000 people. That's an insane amount. I mean, I think it was like at most 200.
Okay. That sounds about more like when it comes down to pogroms, honestly, in general.
Might be the total number of pogroms in a specific time period that I'm thinking of. But yeah, that who died. Still not good. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Good correction. Good catch. So now we're going to talk about the audience of who this book was written for and who it wasn't written for. This book, as well as the rest of the trilogy, was very, very intentionally written about this time in the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the writing was very intentionally done. Writing under the supervision of any Russian government is going to be tricky. Russian censures are a time-honored tradition that doesn't seem to ever go away, and it always existed basically since the time of Russia. So, one of the reasons why Henryk chose to write about the Khmelnytsky uprising was because it would not be blocked by the censors. In fact, there's basically no mention of Russia in this book at all, even though the Cossacks were directly supported by Russia in this war. And then they flipped sides at one point. Of course they did. Mm-hmm. Only the Turks, specifically the Crimean Tatars, and their support from the Ottoman Empire is mentioned intentionally as enemies, which probably made the readers and the censors happy, as the Russian, Prussian, and Austro-Hungarian empires all hated the Ottomans. Furthermore, it doesn't provoke any other major empire that partitioned Poland. Austro-Hungary is basically not mentioned at all, again, save for maybe some few references regarding to the Holy Roman Empire and some support. And Sienkiewicz goes so far as to praise the German-Prussian battalion's heroics at one point. It is early in the book, so it's, again, not giving away too much, but they were a mercenary army paid by the Polish crown, and when offered to switch sides for more pay, they said they would honor their original contract till the end.
Yeah.
Which would, whatever. That doesn't happen with mercenaries.
I don't know. I mean, they're probably part of ducal Prussia, and it would be shitty. It wouldn't look good for their army if they switch sides,
Yeah, we are talking about Prussians here. What am I saying? Yeah.
They're honor bound to an extent, but yeah. They also, there was a ducal Prussia and then a royal Prussia at the time, which were right next to each other, and the Germans living in the Polish lands probably wouldn't they wouldn't be super happy that their comrades would be so, or their countrymen would be so, stingy with what they did.
Now we know the audience, we know the historical context. I'm going to actually finally introduce some of the characters. Every character in this book, I will say, and it's a good bit of feedback I read online, is that every character is a bit one-dimensional, but because they are, this actually allows for Sienkiewicz to make every character way larger than life, and it accentuates their personality traits. Just because they are always constantly going to react the same way, he could make that reaction incredibly ridiculous every single time for some of them, just to the extreme. So much of this book revolves around the concept of honor and tradition, as well, of war that both sides held so dearly, which we all should know, and I will say is completely fantastical. But here we are again, referring back to the fact that this is historical fiction. Any questions so far?
No.
All right.
All straightforward.
We've been talking for an hour. It's been so straightforward.
Yeah.
So Bohdan, I wanted to start with him, even though he's the antagonist, because we've talked about him quite a lot already. He is a cunning and apt field commander, and portrayed so, who has the undying love and commitment of his soldiers. He shows himself to be a good commander very, very early on, and has a silver tongue when convincing people to join his side. He is also a horrible alcoholic.
I mean, yeah, they all were.
But but this guy, to an extent where I was reading it, and I'm like, holy shit. Like you were saying, this is Poland we are talking about in the 17th century,
yeah,
after all.
If you're an alcoholic, how much vodka do you have to drink to be considered having a problem in Poland?
At this time frame, yeah. I mean, he would drink himself into an obliterated states where he was having hallucinations frequently in the book. And he wouldn't get out of his hut. He was considered at least he was portrayed in the book as this guy who would be hidden in his hut, literally staring at walls to figure out what to do next with his army, and having these crazy hallucinations.
Jeez.
And so many of these characters drink, but Khmelnytsky is often held up in his hut for days, just pounding back the vodka in self-inflicted search for moral justification about his actions of uprising, hence the bias that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of the drunken Easterner, too, part of that motif to kind of show this is what these people do, probably was added to it as well.
Yeah, and when he hosts war parties and such, either people were captured or where people are trying to figure out some sort of peace agreement, he is always obliterated, cantankerous, and intentionally belligerent. It's clear bias that Sienkiewicz was trying to write about a figure, again, who is considered a hero by modern Ukrainians and is currently on their currency, if I'm not mistaken. All right. The protagonist, Jan Skshetuski. Jan Skshetuski is a character based on a real person, Mikołaj Skshetuski, and the hero of the last major siege written in this book as well. He is of low nobility and desperately patriotic to both the crown and his commander. Jan is the stereotype of Polish patriotism in the book, wanting to take action but is restricted by the nobility, who are too lazy or vain to make good decisions for the Commonwealth. Patriotism is going to play a massive role throughout the book. Jan is constantly sent out on missions and often finds himself in serious trouble. This is the person who also accidentally frees Khmelnytsky that we were talking about earlier in the opening chapter of the book. Because of this, the two characters actually have a mutual respect and disdain towards one another, since they both feel like they owe one another something, which is pretty fun. This goes back to the concept of fighting with honor and the rules of combat that is portrayed throughout the book. Jan is also also has the love interest and is arguably the main arc of the story, the love interest. Helen Kurtsevochovna was effectively a captive in her own lands by a greedy family trying to keep control of it. They were able to do this because she was an orphan with little power, even though she was of nobility. Helen is a completely fictional character and used to drive the plot of this book, and Helen and Jan fall in love with each other basically on first sight and promise to be with one another forever. However, this is an 1,100-plus page book. Of course, things don't go to plan, and of course, there's another man vying for her love. Jan makes an appearance in The Deluge, and from my basic research, I'm eager to see what his role plays, though to me, he's just like stoic and really harsh by the end of this book. So the one argument I have is that many characters don't develop, but this one, Jan develops negatively. Okay, now Bohun. So we were talking about somebody else vying for Helen's love, Jan's best girl, and that guy is Yuri Bohun. Based again on a real person called Ivan Bohun. Yuri falls...
what a change.
I know, right? Should have called it Ivan. What's the difference there? Yuri falls in love. That's a crazy thing. Yuri Ivan, it still sounds like Ukrainian one way or another.
Yeah. No, it's one's one Ukrainian first name to another one.
Bohun comes from low origins and only gains his status in life from being a ferocious fighter and a born leader. He gains loyalty from other Cossacks because of his leadership and brutality. People are generally and genuinely terrified of Bohun, including Helen herself. Bohun turns around with witches and dark magic, and spoiler alert, he also abducts Helen several times and makes her captive, which, if you want to fall in love with somebody, you want to make sure that you abduct them at least twice in their life.
Yeah, I mean, you got to let them go. That's what they say, right? When you love someone, let them go and find them later.
That's effectively what happens in a very not direct way. Bohm is also described as a darkly handsome man and would have a better life if he was born in a different class, which is absolutely true. And he gets into these crazy, crazy battles. Bohun would be a tragic figure and somebody to sympathize for if it wasn't for the fact that he was constantly abducting a woman.
Was he seen as like, so he's this violent man, right? This violent Ukrainian Easterner kind of guy.
Yeah, in the Polish view, and even on the articles I read, he was a violent human being.
Yeah.
But,
he wasn't the only,
No, we're talking about war.
Yeah.
So somebody who is actually entirely based on a real character, 100%, is Yeremy Wisniewski. Is it Wisniewski with the S with the dot on the top or the dash? It could be Wisniewski. Is it?
I think it's Wisniewski, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, he's a notable military commander who is feared by his enemies and beloved by his troops. He's portrayed as somebody who is gentle to his wife, but is willing to sacrifice his well-being for the Commonwealth. Many, many times in this book do the characters want to give Yeremy complete command of the army, only for an obscure noble to get hussy about somebody who is born beneath them and should have no power at all. Yeremy, at times, is basically the only real commander to put down any part of the rebellion, the only one on the field whatsoever, whereas there's a lot of nobles in Warsaw bickering over who should be leading the army. Whether all of this is actually true or not, Sienkiewicz writes the character of Yeremy as a patriot trying to keep an incredibly disjointed, flawed state from falling into total anarchy 100% of the way through. Every single mention of Yeremy is like that, and he's constantly sacrificing his well-being for it. At one point, there's a description of him being so gaunt because he forgets to eat because he's in constant battle and stressed about it, which I'm sure happens to people who are like that. But, man, you got to eat, right? All right, that is the last of the very serious characters. Wackier characters. And if there was ever one who technically isn't the main protagonist but gets the most screen time, if you ever were going to do a show, it's going to be Jan Zagloba. Lots of this book is following him in his silly antics and adventures that somehow tie back to the main story. And I was 100% there for whenever he was there. He was fun to read about. Pan Zagloba is another noble Polish knight. He is completely fictional, and I think he was written as a foil to the atrocities of war that were an essential theme to this book. When Jan, God, this is such a hard name, even as a Polish reader, Skrzytuski, at first sees Pan Zagloba in the book, he describes him as basically a nothing of a knight, but throughout his many campaigns, he begins to gain respect as a warrior. He is half-blind, bald, very fat, and also a complete drunkard. But whereas...
Fantastic warrior.
Yeah. Bohun, you know...
I mean, half blind, Phil. I mean, I don't understand how someone could do something athletic being half blind.
Yeah, it's not that hard. as Bogdan, Khmelnytsky is like that sad, violent drunk. Pan Zagloba is that jolly, fat, vain, boisterous drunk who tells ridiculous tall tales of his journeys that are completely fantasized.
You're saying Pan, right?
Pan, yeah,
Pan.
P-A-N,
okay, yeah,
Mr.
Mr. Yeah,
Or, you know,
Sir
at this point, yeah.
yeah.
P-A-N, Pan, Sir, yeah. He is often compared to a Shakespeare character called Falstaff, found in Henry the Fourth, parts 1 and 2. I've never read Henry the Fourth. I know that this was like important. I'm sure somebody's going to hear this and go, "Oh, Falstaff from Henry the Fourth." And every time I hear English and Henry, I always revert to Henry the Eighth because that's like the trigger.
Or Henry the Fifth too, right? That's the
next book. I think there's a Henry
Fifth.
Fifth.
That's the Agincourt one. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I said, I've never read these plays, but in both, he's a complete braggart and begins exaggerating his involvement in campaigns and his heroic acts literally as soon as they are done. And like right in front of all the people who saw the acts happen. Because this is an honorable society in this book, when he is called out for exaggeration, he argues loudly and energetically that what he is saying is the complete truth and no one really questions him. His journeys are so super silly. He gets into danger and has to find his way out often. He is fiercely loyal to both Jans, and thereby loyal to Jeremy, and is the main character, always constantly saving Helen. We follow Zagloba throughout much of the conflicts, partially because he's so ridiculous, but also because he is involved in these conflicts intentionally as a foil. He's found in all 3 parts of the trilogy, and if he is as ridiculous in the other 2 parts, again, I'm totally in for it.
Yeah, it's just like a 17th century Mr. Bean in Poland, basically. Is that what he's like?
I mean, kind of, except Mr. Bean is silent, and like he is not silent. He is just a drunken braggart, drinking mead specifically, big fat round belly, and really doesn't want to be involved in anything that he gets into. I almost would picture him as like a half-blind like Obelisk, except Obelisk is brave and he's basically not.
Obelisk from
Asterix and Obelisk.
Yeah.
I kind of looked at him like that, but like, just a big freaking dude.
I mean, I can't think of a specific thing, but yeah, you see that all the time in modern fiction or shows or whatever, you know.
Yeah. And it's like having a foil is really important. Yeah, I'll maybe talk about this little spoiler in the next guy, who is Michał Wolodyjowski. Pan Michał Wolodyjowski is also found in all 3 parts of the trilogy, though he's partially based off of Jerzy Wolodyjowski. Michał is referred to as the Little Knight because he's a short man, but he fights very well and way above his weight class. He's, again, loyal to Jan, and both Jans. I keep saying both Jans because Zagloba is loyal to Jan Zagloba as well.
Yeah, okay.
I
thought I was missing a different Jan. Okay.
He is nowhere near as bold when it comes down to his personality as Zagloba, and is often trying to prove himself as a knight, and he's trying to prove himself as a ladies' man.
Okay. When you said short, he's a short knight. Is that like 5'2"? Like, because everybody there is like.
They didn't give a height. You know, he's just known as a very little man.
Okay.
You know, we're not going to talk too much about Michał here. He does have some pretty epic scenes where he comes and saves the day, and also a very, very cool, and this is kind of a spoiler alert, but epic one-on-one fight with Bohun.
Yeah, is it a duel or is it in the middle of the battle?
It's a duel. It's just like a duel where one of these characters is screaming towards the end of it, bloody murder, because he's about to be killed. and like all the spectators are just like talking like nonchalantly about, well, I'm sorry that like we were at each other's throats earlier, and there's this guy just screaming like for help, and they're like making amends effectively, like casually, and like shaking hands and getting into a gentleman's agreement about, yeah, none of us have to actually fight other than these two. All right, let's get out of here.
Yeah.
So what should we do with him? We'll just take him to the nearest bar, and we'll see if they'll amend him.
Yeah.
Pretty great.
Yeah.
Basically, before the conclusion, the last character we're going to talk about is this man called Longinus. I don't know how to pronounce this because it's Longinus or Longinus. I like Longinus. It's a lot funnier.
It's funnier, sure.
Longinus.
But Longinus is probably closer.
Yeah.
But what? He's an Italian guy?
No, but I'm going to call him Longinus because of it. Longinus Bod B. Pieta. Longinus Longinus is a Lithuanian giant, known for carrying a mighty sword that no man can lift, let alone swing, except for him. Longinus or Longinus, again, Longinus. Longinus.
He named a long man Longinus.
He made a long... Yeah. I don't even know intent. Well, he definitely knew English, so...
Yeah.
He lived in America.
Yeah.
Is a fairly meek, introverted, and not super confident dude, even though he's a great warrior, objectively. Again, he is part of Jan's entourage, Skshetuski's entourage, and swears loyalty to him basically as soon as he meets him. The most important thing you need to know about Longinus is his special oath. He promised that he would not marry or have any sexual relations with a woman until he knocks the heads off of 3 enemies in one big swing of his sword. This is especially important because he is the last of his great line of Lithuanian nobility, and if he doesn't behead 3 enemies, again, in one good swing, the name dies with him. It's a running joke throughout the book as his companions constantly poke fun of his virginity because of his oath. And again, it's him intentionally not doing it. He takes this so seriously, so much so that early on when he describes his oath, he's already said that he's beheaded 2 people at once and almost chopped another one off, but he didn't.
Is that what? Like, he's just like, I gotta get that 3rd one. Like, is that why he did that?
I mean, it was an oath that he did to, I think it was a Christian monk of some sort, and like, if I remember correctly, I don't remember who exactly it was to, but it's just so absurd.
Yeah, I think you can forget that oath, man. I don't think he's gonna remember it or anything. He's probably just dead from the plague. So
yeah, well, yeah, This is so much like they constantly tease him that Pan Zagloba calls him out on his oath constantly, and actually calls it an act of treason against God, because for Zagloba, if God didn't want men to have relations with women, why would he have invented sex? And if you want to know anything, or whether or not Longinus or Longinus does keep his oath or is able to marry, you'll just have to read the book. There are other characters we can go over, like King Jan Kazimir is in it, who will definitely be more important in the other books, I presume, or Zhedjan, who is Jan's cunning servant who gets rich from the invasion. However, I think I provided enough context to understand the first book of the trilogy, and that's really what was in it. I had fun talking about the characters because they were, most of them, very fun. I plan on doing more episodes as I read them, but that might not be for some time to come, honestly, because this is a long, long book. To wrap it up, I wanted to summarize a book review I read on Reddit, because, of course, from a poster, Mick Junker, who posted on R the Mott, which I don't even know what this subreddit's about.
It's Mick Junker.
Mick Junker?
It's a Scottish German guy. Mick
Scottish
Junker.
Swedish guy.
Yeah.
MC capital Junker, so it could be Mick Junker.
Mick Junker.
I don't know what the Mott is about, but he made a good point. So thanks to this random person on the Reddit. One of the biggest themes of With Fire and Sword is bringing order to chaos. This time in the periods in the annals of Polish history when this story takes place, when Sienkiewicz wrote, and currently feels incredibly it feels incredibly chaotic in parts of Ukraine. It's human nature to try to
I'm
impose.
sure it's a bit idiotic too in parts of Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
during
A bit of
war.
a Freudian slip there.
Yeah.
It's human nature to try to impose order amongst the suffering. Sometimes we are able to do so, and other times order fails completely. We might be living in a time where it can go either way, realistically. There is great uncertainty in the world, but there always is. There are many lessons to be learned from this book, like getting rid of lazy officials who don't do anything but muck up progress and stability and don't understand the people at all. And don't invade other people's lands when you have no claim over them. Cough. But you don't have to take my words or lessons that you learn. You should just read the book. It really does read fluidly. It's just an epically great book, and it reads really, really well for something that was published in 1884.
Yeah. I mean, all they had to do was give these Cossacks some more rights. That's all they had to do. Yeah. I mean, maybe they just weren't big fans of the fact that they were slavers or something, but like...
You know what? I don't think it really bothered them that much.
Yeah, I'm sure they didn't care.
They were enslavers themselves, but, you know.
I mean, yeah, peasants, I guess.
Yeah, peasant. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
But they weren't selling people to the Ottoman Empire. You know, now we're getting into the technicalities of slavery, and I fucking think that this is a great time to end the podcast.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. Okay.
Thank you, Jacek. Appreciate it. Well, I'll
No
bring you back on for more historical context whenever you want to.
Okay.